We are here this weekend to talk about why cities are important to Christian mission and what the best way is to carry out that mission to cities. And speaking tonight as an urban analyst, as someone who looks at cities every day, I want to try to shed a little light on that by trying to answer a couple questions for you in brief. One, why are cities important to the world generally? And second, why are global cities of particular importance? First, why are cities important? Well, at some level, it's just as simple as the reason Willie Sutton famously gave when people ask him why rob banks. Because that's where the money is, right? Why city? It's because that's where the people are. We are in the midst of the most profound demographic shift in the history of humanity, namely the move of going from living a predominantly village and rural existence to a predominantly urban one. And when we think about history, I think we can often be misled because when we think back, we tend to think about the great cities of the past, Babylon, Athens, or Rome. But the reality is, until quite recently, almost nobody lived in cities. As recently as 100 years ago, only 10% of the global population lived in cities. Today, it's over 50%. By mid-century, it'll be 75%. And by the end of this century, humanity will have completed the transition going from living in almost entirely rural village existence, as I said, to an almost entirely urban one. NYU economist Paul Romer likens this to humanity going from living like packs of wolves to living more like ants or termites. And while the imagery may not be that appetizing, I think it's a good picture of the radical nature of that shift. So if you want to reach people at the end of the day, you have to reach cities because that's where the people are and are going. And just one more stat to throw a little color on it. By 2025, just 12 years from now, in China alone, there will be another 355 million people living in cities. That's more than the entire population of the United States. So the magnitude of this shift is huge. And obviously, keeping up with that growth is a huge challenge across the board. According to McKinsey Consulting, by 2025, in just the top 600 global cities alone, we're going to be requiring an additional $10 trillion a year in physical capital investments just to keep up with population growth. $10 trillion a year. Just to put that number in perspective, the entire US economy is only about $15 trillion a year. So in the near future, we're going to be spending the equivalent of 2/3 of the entire economic output of the United States just on the physical stuff that we need to support population growth in cities. It's truly staggering. So the question I'd ask in kind of reaction to that is, if we need to spend $10 trillion a year on physical infrastructure for our cities to keep up with growth, how much do you think we need to spend on our spiritual infrastructure, churches, parachurch ministries, training, et cetera, to keep up with the growth? And just a quick thought experiment on that. Back to our China example, we're going to see about 27 million people a year moving to cities in China. And as a rule of thumb, we should have a minimum, and I repeat, an absolute minimum of one church for every 10,000 people in a city. Now keep in mind, right here today in Manhattan, we've got one church for every 5,500 people. So we're already almost twice that density, and the population is only 3% evangelical Christian. But even at that much lower ratio, we would need another 2,700 urban church plants a year in China just to keep up with population growth. That's 7 urban church plants every single day. And frankly, in China, it's even higher because you need smaller churches to avoid having the government catch attention with you. So the need for spiritual infrastructure is just gigantic. And some of you may say, well, China, we get it. And I think everybody does get it on emerging world growth at some level. But the reality is this trend is affecting us even right here in the United States. If you think back to that Rust Belt era of the 70s and the early 80s, it was a pretty bleak time for cities. Seattle was in such bad shape that somebody put up a billboard that's still kind of famous today. Well, the last one leaving Seattle, please turn out the lights. And that's the origin of that phrase, I do believe. The Chicago Tribune did a 4-part cover series called A City on the Brink. New York nearly went bankrupt, as you know, which prompted the famous Daily News headline, Ford to City, drop dead. You didn't even want to go in the parks in the daytime back then. In fact, as recently as 1990, Time magazine did a cover story called The Rotting of the Big Apple, right? Today, what a difference. I mean, just look around the city. Even the Bronx is no longer burning, as I like to say. And the cities, not just the greater metropolitan regions, but the core cities of New York, LA, and San Francisco are now at all-time population highs. Places like Philadelphia and the District of Columbia, they have bounced back and are now growing again after 5 straight decades of population declines. New York is expecting another 1 million residents by 2030. San Francisco, another 152,000 residents by 2035. And this in places that are already jam-packed full to the gills. And it shows the tremendous demand for urban living, and it's happening right now. Even today, in the District of Columbia, another 1,000 people a month net are moving into the city. So even here, yes, emerging world huge, but even right here in America, there's a tremendous sea change in the fortunes of urban areas, which in many cases are growing strongly again. So that's the case for cities in brief. Well, what about global cities in particular? And first you might ask, what is a global city? And there's a lot of definitions, but I think at some level it's one of those things where you know it when you see it. Saskia Sassen, who's a sociologist who literally wrote a book called The Global City, she likes to talk about them in terms of being the command nodes of the global economy. Other people like to talk about things like international flight connections or world-renowned cultural institutions, media or tourism power. You know, a lot of the power of a city does derive from the way that it has these dense concentrations of so many people who are so different from each other. And the global city is the place where these concentrations are at their most intense. But however you want to think about it, global cities are the cities that are known on a first-name basis around the world, right? New York, London, Hong Kong, Shanghai, Tokyo, right? And reaching these particular cities is critical because it is global cities that is where the culture is made. So if you want to affect the culture at all, you have to go to the global city. For example, here in the United States, virtually all national media originates in only 3 cities, New York, LA, and DC. And just as one quick and simple example of the pervasive influence of global cities on the American fabric, think back about even how battered 1970s Seattle. It had this rich underground coffeehouse scene that birthed a movement out of which came Starbucks that completely revolutionized coffee drinking in America and even spawned this entire new concept called the third place that never existed in America before. So I think that's just one small sample of how the global city affects us. And there are probably things going on underground right here today in New York. We don't even know what they are, but they're going to radically reshape our world 10, 20, 30 years from now. So the global city is critical. And the great thing about global cities is that we can influence how they develop. And that's because cities today aren't just geographic spaces with people and buildings. They're really more like networks. People, capital, products, and ideas, you know, they come in, they flow out all over the world, right? So we consume what comes out of global cities, but we're not just passive consumers. We also contribute what goes into them. It's a bidirectional flow in and out. So maybe to adapt a phrase, we shape our global cities, then they shape us. So the global city is not just a challenge to people, it's also a tremendous opportunity, even if you, like me, who I live in Providence, Rhode Island, don't live in a global city. The other thing to note about global cities is that they're not monolithic. And again, I think we can be misled because we travel around and we tend to meet in the same kind of like very high-end office space or phenomenal meeting venues like this. There's the same swank restaurants, the Louis Vuitton store, the designer hotel, the sleek international airports. And without a doubt, globalization has, to some extent, homogenized cities because globalization demands standardized products that can be graded and traded on a global basis. But when you peek under the covers, what you see is just how different these cities are from each other. Just think about, for example, the difference between New York and LA. You could almost rest your case right there. But anybody seen a Woody Allen movie? That's my evidence. But you know, Saskia Sassen wrote about this. She said, the deep economic history of a place matters for the type of knowledge economy a city winds up developing. This goes against the common view that globalization homogenizes urban economies. And CEOs for Cities, which is one of the leading urbanist organizations in the United States, they did a ton of economic research about what it is that makes cities successful. And they discovered that they could boil it down to about 4 categories of success factors, one of which is distinctiveness, or the things that make cities different from each other. Think about, for example, the music industry in Nashville, or that Dutch trading culture that's still so powerful here in New York, or Houston's laissez-faire, no zoning approach to development, or Portland's environmental values. These are just radically different cities. So if you want to reach them, you have to contextualize what you're doing to the ethos of that city. And that's true for anything. If you want to be in the pizza business, you got to know the difference between New York and Chicago style, right? If you want to sell a product people want to buy. And candidly, I think this is something that even too many urbanists, my own crowd, people who purport to be advocates of cities, too often fail to take into account. I think the urbanist crowd often proposes for their cities what I like to call Starbucks urbanism. It's kind of the same dense, walkable, mixed-use developments with condos, coffee shops, bike lanes, etc., mostly targeted at the affluent. And not that there's anything wrong with these, but most of these proposals are so generic. They could be from any city, and they aren't really rooted in a place. So I think this notion of the distinctiveness of cities is something that's frankly underappreciated. And lastly, I will mention that even the religious history of a place plays a huge role in how a city develops. Just think about the difference between the Puritan Calvinist origins of Boston and how that propelled that city to become the intellectual capital of America versus the more leveling influence of Quakerism on Philadelphia. I don't know if anybody's in Philly, but I've always said Philadelphia is by far the largest city in America. You just don't hear that much about. And part of it is because of that Quaker modesty that produced a culture that's not quite as prideful and boisterous as a lot of other places. So I think that it shows that not only does Christianity play a huge influence in how cities develop, but the particular brand of Christianity, the type of Christianity that takes root in a place is very important because it becomes indigenous in the culture. So basically, to sum it up, cities are important because that's where the people are and where they're going. And global cities are particularly important because they play an outsized role in culture, commerce, and so much more. But global cities are very tricky because you have to balance the areas where globalization has homogenized versus the areas where these places are just so very different. It's very tricky. You can't come to with a school solution to a global city. Maybe you can have a playbook, but you really have to contextualize and tailor it to the particular city you're trying to reach. So, how would I respond to this urban century? I would just say, in this century, loving and serving cities, especially global cities, and doing it well is very important. So I would encourage you to do that however your heart is moved, and don't forget about your own city.